Welcome to Joe's Astrology. And Jupiter is making an opposition to Mercury this week. And I want to tell a story, personal story that I started thinking of 7 years, about 7 years ago. Actually, it would have been 8 years ago, a little more than 8 years ago. I had a crossroads, so to speak. I was coaching tennis. If you don't know this, I used to coach tennis. I used to have a indoor tennis club that I rented after coaching for a while, and I was searching for a business, searching for a purpose, and I thought I knew what I wanted to do. I thought I knew what was going to happen in the future. So during this time, I was 2 years in to doing a lot of things that I didn't think were possible, and I realized that 2 years into this business that this location was not going to work. I was going to be stuck in a sense. I felt like I was going to be stuck. And stay with me here. This is what I'm going to talk about, how this relates to astrology. So I went out and I started looking for a different location, and I found two different locations that I thought would work. They were both better locations, two opposite sides of town. And the first one I really liked. The price was so cheap for how much square footage I was going to get. The location was perfect. There was so much about it that was perfect. And I think if I would have got it, I actually would have made a lot of money pretty fast. So my profit would have been, at the time, I wasn't really profiting. You could say I was profiting I was just working kind of like a normal job. I was making around $2,000 to $3,000 a month. And then if I would have got this location, I think I would have cleared $100,000. Within 2 years, I would have been making $100,000 a year, doing what I thought I loved, etc., being in tennis and whatnot. So then there was, so long story short, that guy didn't rent. He wouldn't rent to me. He wouldn't rent to me because it wasn't like a recreational kind of zone as far as like the zoning goes. And then there was this other place, which was in a recreational zone. It was in like one of those sports parks, so tennis would have been perfect there from their eyes. They, the facility, the person who owned the facility, they kind of were excited about it. They wanted it there, but it was very expensive. It was a little bit less square footage, and it was double the price of the other one. And it was more than double than what I was paying now. And I signed the contract on it. I signed the contract to make the move. And the thing is, it was a 10-year contract. And I kept doing the numbers over and over again, and I felt like I made a mistake. So I went back on the contract. The whole thing was a disaster because of a number of things that were going on with what had to happen, and it was a whole ordeal. But I got out of it, and I got out of the whole thing clean. I was done. I wasn't in tennis anymore that quick. Within 6 months, 6 months later after that. And I want to tell this story because that was 7 years ago, and here I am 7 years later. And of course, there was the COVID and things like that. And I look at a life like this, and nothing really has changed. So what I mean by that is, if you go back and I would have signed that contract, I would have been 10 years in. To this day, I would have been 7 or 8 years in. And based on everything that I think I know about the situation, I can't say for sure, but it probably would have took about 6 to 8 years to really get settled, because with COVID and all that, I would have been stuck. And then here we are, 8 years, and I feel like moving forward from where I am now, that I'm in a good position to finally have some kind of stability after all of that. So the reason why I mention that is, if I go back, we take the astrology, we look at the astrology of a person like myself, and we go back. Let's say I would have continued with the first club, or let's say I would have continued with that contract. Either one, in my opinion, to this day, I'd be in the same situation financially that I was 8 years ago. And I'd be in the same situation personally, really. The only other difference is my network might be, I can't even say that, but my network would be maybe a little bit larger, and for certain in the tennis industry, my network would be a lot larger. But I was doing other work at the same time. I don't know that my network really would have been much larger. So the reason why I mention all of that, a lot of times with astrology, I get a lot of people call and do an astrology reading, and they're worried about the future. They're worried about decisions that they have to make. And what I want to impress upon you in this video from that story is that I thought that I had, in my world, I had a lot of quote unquote decisions to make. And here we are 8 years later, and we can see that essentially when it comes down to a lot of things that people are worrying about, I really didn't have a decision at all. It didn't matter. Based on the 3 different decisions, I am exactly where I would have been 7 or 8 years ago, just in a different world, so to speak, a different situation. Now, when it comes down to that being a different world, that's what actually matters. But when it comes down to these things that people are worrying about, more likely than not, that's not going to change. So we're talking about your financial situation. If you're making 6 figures now, and you're worried about what's going to happen in 8 years, I can tell you right now, more likely than not, you're going to be making 6 figures in 8 years. If you're married, or if you're single, let's say if you're married, more likely than not, in 8 years, you're going to be married as well. If you're been in a relationship for most of your life, more likely than not, in 8 years, you're going to still be in a relationship, no matter what happens in that relationship. If you're single, same thing. Because in order for that to turn, so if you look at my situation again, go back. Well, really what I was doing was the exact same thing. Even when I started my first club, I was still making the same money as I was when I was just a coach. The only thing that changed was I could do more what I wanted to do. I was more in control of my world to a certain degree. But with a lot of these things that we see with astrology, that we can see like the big changes. Nothing really was any different. So that is kind of like, I guess I'd say that's good news and it's bad news at the same time. The good news is, for me, it alleviates the worry. Just make a decision. If you have decisions to make the decision. Because more likely than not, you're not in control of the result.